The day Karen called 911 on me for pitching a tent was supposed to be a peaceful weekend by the lake. No noise, no crowds. Just me, a campfire, and a quiet night under the stars on land I legally owned. But apparently, my tent offended her HOA sensibilities. She showed up with a clipboard, barking about community regulations, accused me of trespassing on common grounds, and within 5 minutes had 911 on the line, reporting a suspicious squatter. But what Karen didn't realize, that lake, that shoreline, and the land under my boots, they were mine, on record, in ink, and filed at the county registrar. And that bogus call? It sparked something in me, because 5 days later, I bought the private street she lived on and legally shut it down. You mess with my peace, I'll buy your path to it. Some people buy vacation homes in the mountains. Others choose coastal retreats or fancy ski lodges. Me, I inherited a quiet stretch of land by a lake, about 4 acres of wooded shoreline, passed down through 3 generations of my family. It wasn't flashy or lucrative. No powerboat docks, no lake house with 10 bedrooms and a wine cellar. Just trees, water, and quiet. Exactly what I needed. After years grinding through the city, chasing contracts, deadlines, and the illusion of peace, that land became my sanctuary. I had no interest in developing it or turning it into a rental. I just wanted to exist without being watched, managed, or corrected. No emails, no meetings, just birds, breeze, and the sound of lake water lapping against the rocks. That particular weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done in over a decade. Camp. Just me, a sleeping bag, my tent, and a small fire ring near the water's edge. No distractions. No signal. No noise. By noon on Friday, I was all set. I parked my truck on the gravel entry near the tree line, hauled my gear about 50 feet down to a flat clearing with a perfect view of the lake, and pitched my tent. It took 10 minutes tops. I wasn't bothering anyone. No generators, no loud music. Just peace. Or so I thought. Around 4 p.m., just as I was setting up my little cook stove, I heard a car slow down on the gravel road behind the trees. Then footsteps. Loud, deliberate footsteps. I turned to see a woman in khaki capris, white sneakers that had never touched mud, and a pastel windbreaker that looked like it belonged on a yacht club billboard. Her blonde hair was stiff with hairspray, and she carried what could only be described as a weaponized clipboard. "Excuse me," she barked before I could even say hello. "What do you think you're doing here?" I blinked. Camping." "On whose authority?" she snapped. "My own." I kept my voice calm. "I own this land." She snorted. Actually snorted. "This is common space. HOA maintained property. Private landowners aren't allowed to camp on lake-adjacent land without board approval." That stopped me cold. "I think you're mistaken. This isn't part of the HOA. I checked the property lines myself. It was deeded to my grandfather before the subdivision was even built." She took a step closer, squinting at me like she was trying to identify a rare pest. "I am Karen Wellington, HOA president for Lakeside Preserve. And I assure you, sir, this area is protected under community regulations. We've had problems with vagrancy before." "Vagrancy?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Lady, I pay taxes on this soil. And if you'd like, I can walk to my truck and show you the deed." She didn't budge. "I don't need to see your so-called paperwork," she snapped. "You're on protected land, and I'm calling the police." I paused for a long moment, caught between disbelief and amusement. "You're serious?" "Deadly." She pulled out her phone and began dialing. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser at the southern edge of Lakeside Preserve. He's camping on the ground near Lot 46. Yes, he's being aggressive." I stood still, calm, listening. She was layering on falsehoods faster than I could count. Aggressive? I hadn't even raised my voice. As she spoke, I took a breath and watched the water. I could feel my jaw tighten, but I didn't bite. Not yet. Not here. That wasn't how my grandfather raised me. Karen ended the call with an air of triumph. "The sheriff's deputies are on their way," she said, like she had just ordered an eviction. "Great," I said flatly. "Then we'll let them settle it." She gave me a smug little smirk, one foot tapping on the dry leaves, as if she couldn't wait to see me hauled off like some trespassing squatter. I walked over to the tent, zipped it up, and sat in my folding chair, watching the lake as the sun began dipping low in the sky. I didn't look at her again. I didn't say another word. When the cruiser pulled up 20 minutes later, she sprang into action. "There!" she cried, waving the officers over. "That's him. He refuses to leave. He's pitching a tent on community property." Two deputies emerged from the vehicle, one older, one younger. The older one took the lead. He was calm, measured, already skeptical. "Sir, good evening. We received a report. Can you tell us what's going on here?" I stood, pulled out my phone, and opened the PDF file of my property survey. "My name's Mark Reeves," I said. "This is my land. Bought it outright from my grandfather's estate 2 years ago. Here's the deed, the boundary markers, and the county assessor's map. You'll see the line runs from the ridge up there." I pointed toward the trees, down to the rocks at the shoreline. "That tent? Dead center on my lot." The older officer took my phone and studied the documents. His partner walked a few paces into the clearing, noting the orange boundary stakes. Karen tried to cut in. "That land was donated to the HOA. It's in our charter." "No, ma'am," I said, still calm. "A lot of the shoreline was, yes, but not this stretch. This parcel predates the development by over 40 years. My grandfather refused to sell when they were building Lakeside Preserve. It's never been part of the HOA. You can look that up." The younger deputy returned. "He's right. There's a posted marker nailed to the pine tree just off the trail. Lot 102, C, private." The older deputy handed my phone back, nodding. "Everything checks out, sir. You're well within your rights." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Ma'am," the deputy said firmly, turning to her, "we're going to ask you not to call in trespassing complaints unless you've confirmed the property status. False reports can lead to charges." "Understood." She blinked. "But he's camping. There are rules." "Not for land he owns," the deputy replied. "This isn't HOA jurisdiction." She stood frozen, lips pressed into a sharp line. I waited for the smug retort, for the thinly veiled insult. But she had nothing. Instead, she spun on her heel and walked away, muttering something about checking with the board. I sat back down in my folding chair and let out a breath. I should have felt vindicated, but I didn't. Not really, because Karen hadn't just challenged my right to camp. She called the police on me for existing peacefully on my own land. And if she was this confident about storming into a space that clearly wasn't hers, how many others had she intimidated into silence? That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I felt unsafe, but because I felt curious. Who was she to act with that much certainty? Why did she believe she had the right to patrol land she didn't own? What kind of authority did this HOA president think she had? That was the beginning. Because while she went home thinking she'd shut down a camper, I went home and started digging. The next morning, I packed up my tent, folded my chair, and took one last long look at the lake before heading out. The calm was still there. The water still shimmered like glass. The birds still chirped like nothing had happened. But something had shifted in me. The kind of shift that comes when you realize you're not dealing with a misunderstanding. You're dealing with someone who knows they're overstepping. Karen hadn't been confused. She'd been confident. She'd marched in with legal language and threats, called the police without flinching, and treated me like a squatter on land that had belonged to my family for decades. People like that don't stop after one encounter. So on the drive back, a question kept circling in my mind. Who else had she done this to? By Monday, I was digging. First, I logged into the county GIS system and reviewed the property plat maps for Lakeside Preserve. I zoomed in on my lot and the surrounding parcels. Sure enough, just like I told the officers, my land stood alone, technically adjacent to, but never included within, the Lakeside Preserve HOA boundaries. It was like an island, grandfathered in before the whole development was ever imagined. The records went back to 1964. But more interestingly, the common spaces Karen had been referencing in her accusations were extremely limited in scope. There were 2 small strips of HOA-controlled land near the north entrance and a walking trail easement around the western ridge. But no part of the shoreline, southern tree line, or eastern road system belonged to the HOA. Not legally. I checked twice. Then I highlighted the boundaries, printed them out, and stuck them to my wall. Next, I reviewed the HOA's publicly available documents, meeting minutes, bylaw amendments, and newsletters. It took hours, but I started to see patterns. Karen's name was everywhere. She was always the one proposing new restrictions. No outdoor fires after 8 p.m., no hanging chairs on porches, no more than 2 pets per household. One bizarre note even listed unsanctioned lakeside activity as a violation with no actual legal definition attached. But what jumped out at me most was how often fines were issued without a hearing or review board. In some meeting notes, there were vague phrases like Karen followed up on the Miller Law dispute or Karen handled compliance issue personally. No votes, no board consensus. That's not how it's supposed to work. So I started walking. The following weekend, I visited the community again, but not to camp. This time, I strolled slowly down the private road that curved behind the development, notebook in hand, pretending to be checking survey stakes. A few residents waved, some looked wary. I knocked on 3 doors. The first 2 were polite but cautious. One woman said she'd rather not get involved, and another simply said, Karen's been running things for a while, best to stay out of it. But the third door changed everything. It belonged to a man named Victor Langston, a retired forest ranger with a limp and a sun-scorched porch full of bird feeders and wood carvings. I remember you, he said, squinting. You the fella who had the cops called on him last week. I nodded. That was me. He motioned to a chair. Well, sit down then. You're not the first. That got my attention. Victor leaned back in his rocker and told me his story. 2 summers ago, he'd installed a floating dock for his canoe. Nothing fancy, just a few planks and some barrels. Within a week, Karen showed up with a printed notice that said he was in violation of the HOA's lakefront usage code. She said I didn't file a request, he grunted. I told her I didn't have to. My deed gives me 30 feet of riparian rights. She just stared at me like I was speaking Greek. Victor ignored the fine. Karen sent a second. When he refused to pay, she threatened to file a lien. But the funny part, he added, grinning, I checked the registry. That whole stretch of road she marches up and down with her clipboard, turns out it's privately maintained. But the county never officially deeded it to the HOA. So technically, it's still for sale. That little spark in my head ignited. Wait, the road wasn't owned by the HOA? That would mean Karen had been issuing citations, parking notices, and property threats on a street her board didn't even control. Victor gave me a knowing look. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? It did more than that. It sent me straight back to the county recorder's office. Over the next 2 days, I pulled every record I could. Road easements, developer transfers, title deeds. And there it was, clear as day. The southern road leading in a lakeside preserve was technically still owned by the original land trust that built the neighborhood. The HOA had leased access on a default renewal, but never purchased the deed. And the land trust? It had dissolved, which meant the right to purchase that road, the same one Karen used to patrol and enforce her little fiefdom, was now in limbo, and publicly purchasable. I sat back in my chair and laughed. But first, I needed more. I kept digging, visiting more neighbors, people who had once kept quiet but were ready to talk once I shared what I'd found. Like the Kellers, fined $250 for unauthorized window coverings that were actually solar blackout curtains. Or Denise, who received 5 warnings in one summer for having non-native plants in her backyard, plants that had been growing there since she bought the house. Karen, it seemed, had been terrorizing the community for years. Fines, threats, gossip, and intimidation. And no one had ever stopped her because she hid behind the HOA charter like a badge. But her authority was built on assumption, not law. She acted like she owned the lake. She acted like she owned the roads. She acted like she owned me when I pitched that tent. And I realized something. If her power came from illusion, then I could tear it apart with facts. So I did. I compiled a folder. Maps, citations, resident statements, financial reports, and Karen's correspondence. I took photos of every citation posted on someone's door. I traced the paper trail of HOA meetings that illegally bypassed member votes. And then I filed a complaint with the county auditor's office. But I didn't stop there. I called a real estate attorney. We reviewed the deed status of the southern road and confirmed it was eligible for private acquisition due to administrative abandonment. Can I buy it? I asked. He paused. With the right paperwork? Yes. But why would you want to? I leaned back and smiled. Because sometimes the fastest way to stop a bully is to own the path she walks on. The more I read the land records, the more I realized Karen's power wasn't built on stone. It was built on paperwork no one had ever bothered to verify. Her authority depended on people assuming she was right, on fear, not fact. And in the gaps where no one questioned her, she planted her flag and acted like queen. But now I had a map, a real one. Not the colorful HOA welcome brochure with its polite rules and walking trails, but the black and white legal framework of who owned what and who didn't. And Karen? She didn't know much of anything, especially not the road. It turns out the southern street she used as her personal patrol route, where she marched around citing homeowners and warning campers, had never been formally transferred to the HOA. It wasn't technically public either. It was privately maintained via operational easement, a fancy way of saying it existed in a legal gray area and was still under the ownership of a dissolved land trust. That made it purchasable, so I called the county registrar. It wasn't quick. It involved 3 different departments, 2 notarized letters, and a review process for default title claim transfers. But 2 weeks later, I was standing in front of a desk at the county office, signing papers that made it official. I now owned the road Karen had been weaponizing against the entire community. Let that sink in. I didn't sue her. I didn't get loud or dramatic. I just bought the street out from under her authority. The best part? She had no idea. Not yet. I didn't announce it. I didn't post signs. I waited. While the ink dried, I filed 2 more formal complaints. One with the County Housing Authority, outlining Karen's repeated overreach and citation of non-HOA landowners, backed with maps, signatures from 6 residents, and scanned HOA notices that clearly stepped beyond their charter. The second went to the Department of Transportation Easement Board, documenting her unauthorized signage and traffic restrictions on a road she no longer controlled. Meanwhile, I worked with my attorney to draft a limited-use easement agreement. The idea wasn't to lock the community out. I wasn't becoming the next Karen. I just wanted her and her inner circle to feel what it was like to be held accountable by someone who actually knew what ownership meant. Then one morning, I finally dropped the curtain. It was a warm Saturday, and Karen was out doing her usual HOA patrol, clip-clopping up and down the road in her bright white sneakers and pastel windbreaker. She was taping a new violation notice to someone's mailbox for unsightly lawn clutter when a delivery truck stopped at the road entrance. The driver rolled down the window and asked where he could park. "Not on this street," Karen barked. "HOA policy prohibits overnight delivery trucks." I stepped out of my truck, deed folder in hand. "That's funny," I said, approaching casually, "because last I checked, you're giving orders on a street you don't own." She whipped around, eyes already narrowing. "You again, still pretending that tint of yours means you have rights." I opened the folder and handed her a notarized copy of the deed. "This isn't about the tint anymore," I said. "It's about the road. This road, the one you've been issuing fines on for 5 years. The one you told police was HOA property. As of last Thursday, it's mine." Her face went blank. "I don't believe you." "You don't have to," I replied. "But the Department of Transportation does. So it does the county registry. You can call them." She snatched the paper and stared at it, scanning for any sign of forgery. But there wasn't one. It was real. It was legal. And it was ironclad. "I'm putting in a call to the board," she snapped. "This is illegal. You can't just buy a road." "Actually," I said, smiling, "you can if it was never claimed. And while you were too busy finding people for bird feeders and porch lights, I was reading the fine print." Then came phase 2. A week later, I installed 3 modest signs along the road. Private road. Entry subject to easement agreement. For access inquiries, contact property owner. I didn't restrict movement. I didn't block anyone. But I did file the easement agreement with the HOA. It included new guidelines. No citations may be issued to properties accessed via this road unless proof of direct HOA jurisdiction is presented. No signage, speed bumps, or restrictions may be added without written approval from the road owner. All HOA meetings involving the road must include the owner as an invited party. Karen went ballistic. First came the emails, long, furious, half-legal gibberish accusing me of intimidation, blackmail, and sabotaging community trust. Then came the emergency board meeting, where she tried to rally support to sue me for hostile acquisition. But it fell apart fast, because when she presented her case to the board and the community, she had nothing. No ownership record, no easement rights, no legal leg to stand on. And worse, people had started listening to me. I hadn't just exposed Karen's bluff, I'd handed the community a mirror. Residents came forward with their own stories. They admitted how afraid they'd been to speak up. One man confessed he'd paid 3 separate non-compliance fines that had no actual legal justification, just to avoid being harassed. The HOA board, now backed into a corner, issued a statement distancing themselves from Karen. They promised a formal review. Karen tried to bluff her way through it, calling me a disgruntled outsider with too much money and too much time. But then the county ethics board opened an inquiry into her actions, citing a pattern of HOA overreach, discriminatory enforcement, and false reporting to authorities. It was a perfect storm. And Karen? She was standing in the middle of it, without shelter, without authority, and now, without her favorite road. For the first time, she was speechless. The road she'd used to control others now was hers to ask permission to use. Karen didn't take her fall quietly. In fact, the moment she realized the road was no longer hers to command or weaponize, she kicked off a final campaign of chaos, clawing desperately at the crumbling walls of the empire she'd ruled unchecked for far too long. Her first move was panic disguised as leadership. She called an emergency HOA meeting just 2 days after the signs went up on the now privately owned road. Her subject line read, "Community crisis, immediate response required." The invite went out to every resident in the neighborhood. When people arrived at the community clubhouse, they found Karen at the front of the room, pacing behind the podium like a general preparing for battle. Her usually impeccable hair was stiff, her voice sharp, and her presentation frantic. She opened with a dramatic retelling of the tent incident, claiming a trespasser had used a legal loophole to steal control of a critical community roadway. She called me a squatter-turned-saboteur, accused me of bribing county officials, and warned the entire community that I was planning to commercialize the land, turning the peaceful lake into a profit-driven RV park. People were stunned. Even the ones who once backed her were looking at each other like they'd walked into the wrong room. Then, without warning, she unveiled a stack of new violation notices. At least a dozen. Freshly issued, signed by her alone, and all dated that morning. Naomi got one, for excessive vehicle presence in her driveway. The Chungs received one for non-standard porch ornamentation. Even Mr. Langston, yes, the retired ranger with the bird feeders, had been slapped with a $300 fine for improper deck coloration, citing a faded corner of wood he hadn't gotten around to staining. It was absurd and obvious. Karen wasn't maintaining the neighborhood. She was retaliating. And that's when I stood up. Not with anger, not even with smugness. I just pulled out a simple brown folder, walked to the front of the room, and handed it to the board secretary. "This," I said, "is a full record of the road acquisition, the easement agreement, the land boundary filings, and the HOA charter violations committed by Karen Wellington over the last 6 years, fully annotated, signed by 10 residents, and verified by the county." I turned to the room. No one here broke the rules, but someone here broke your trust. Repeatedly, openly, and now legally. Gasps rippled through the room. The board president, newly appointed after 2 members resigned under pressure, took the folder and started flipping through the documents. He didn't even get halfway through before he looked up and cleared his throat. "I think this warrants an executive review," he said. "Effective immediately." Karen's face went white, but it got worse. The following week, the county ethics board followed up with a formal inquiry into her history of citations, financial authorizations, and use of HOA funds. They subpoenaed her emails, reviewed the contracts she signed without board approval. One landscaping vendor turned out to be her cousin's son. Another, a close friend who'd billed the HOA for security assessments that had never occurred. She tried to spin it, tried to claim she was protecting community standards and acting with urgency in uncertain times. But her credibility had rotted out from under her. And the residents? They were no longer afraid. One by one, people began sharing their stories, on record, in meetings, even online. Naomi spoke about being cited the day after she filed a noise complaint against Karen's late-night party. The Chung showed pictures of their garden before and after being forced to remove unauthorized plantings. Laura and Daniel revealed they paid over $1,000 in fines over 2 years, and not one had gone through a board vote. And the hammer came down. The county's interim findings revealed Karen had issued at least 38 fines without proper board approval. 12 were issued to properties outside of HOA jurisdiction, including mine. She had lied about easement control, created fake compliance panels, and ignored mandatory appeal windows. The HOA board had no choice. They suspended her indefinitely. 3 days later, Karen sent out a mass email titled "My Resignation," dripping with denial and self-pity. She blamed toxic misinformation, outside manipulation, and community betrayal. But no one replied. Instead, something incredible happened. The neighborhood, once so fractured, quiet, and afraid, began to heal. The HOA rolled back every fine Karen had issued in the last 2 years. They apologized publicly and refunded what they could. The board held open forum meetings where residents could propose actual changes without fear of retaliation. The road? Still mine, but now governed by a simple use agreement. Safe access for all, no more weaponized enforcement. I even offered to work with the board to improve signage and safety along the stretch, provided they never again used it as leverage against residents. For the first time in years, people walked their dogs without worrying about citations. Kids played without being shushed by clipboard warriors. Neighbors started waving again, not just out of habit, but out of relief. And Karen? She disappeared. Her house went up for sale within a month. Rumor has it she moved out of state. Some said she tried to start over in another HOA, but someone sent the inquiry report to her new board before she unpacked her wine rack. Poetic justice. One morning, as I was planting some native shrubs near the base of the road, Mr. Langston shuffled by, tipping his ball cap with a grin. "Hell of a move, kid," he said. "Not every day you see someone win a war without firing a shot." I smiled. Sometimes you just have to own the battlefield. And that was the truth. Karen had played power games in a sandbox she didn't even own. I just bought the sandbox and gave the toys back to the people she took them from. And as I stood there, watching families walk freely down the road she once ruled like a queen, I felt something better than victory. I felt peace. Karen's resignation landed with a quiet thud. No fanfare, no sympathy, just a community exhaling in relief. The woman who once ruled the neighborhood with threat letters and clipboard ultimatums was now just a name fading from inboxes and meeting minutes. And with her departure, something even more powerful arrived. Reform. It started small. The HOA board, newly restructured and no longer under Karen's thumb, held a special session to rewrite the rules. Not behind closed doors, but with the community present. Residents sat in folding chairs, sipping coffee and sharing their ideas for what fair governance could actually look like. Term limits were reinstated. Fines could no longer be issued without a recorded vote and written justification. Appeals had to be heard within 10 days, and no citation could be delivered without photographic evidence and a majority board signature. For the first time, the rules didn't just serve power, they protected people. When it came to the road I'd acquired, I knew it could have been a flex point. I owned it legally, and technically I could have limited access, installed gates, or monetized it out of spite. But that was never the point. I worked with the new board to draft an open use agreement, one rooted in mutual respect. It guaranteed residents uninterrupted access as long as the HOA agreed never to use the road, or the land it touched, as leverage again. That clause became known unofficially as the Karen Clause. The new board even posted a community sign near the road's entrance, hand-painted by some of the neighborhood kids. "Welcome to Lakeview Lane, private land, shared peace." In the weeks that followed, I watched something remarkable unfold. Naomi hosted a potluck in her backyard. The Chungs brought homemade dumplings. The Kellers set up lawn games. And for the first time in years, neighbors didn't avoid eye contact. They leaned in. They asked questions, shared stories, and laughed about the HOA madness like it was folklore. Mr. Langston carved a small wooden bench and placed it by the old pine tree at the bend in the road. He added a brass plate that simply read, "For those who stood up." I found it one morning with a cup of coffee in hand, and for a while I just sat there, listening to the birds, watching the lake. No police cruisers, no notices taped to doors, just calm. Later that month, the board invited me to speak at a town hall. Not formally, just a few words about how it all happened. I almost said no, but then I realized it wasn't about me. It was about what we'd all come through. I told them that owning land doesn't give you power. Knowing what to do with it does. I told them that silence might keep things quiet, but it doesn't make things right. And most of all, I told them that one person standing up isn't a disruption. It's the first brick in a better foundation. When I finished, I didn't expect applause, but I got something better. People stood, one by one, quietly, out of respect. The kind of respect Karen had demanded but never earned. And as I walked home that evening, the gravel crunching underfoot on the road she used to patrol, I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my peace. We all had, together. Sometimes owning land isn't just about peace. It's about holding the line when others forget where it is. Karen thought her clipboard and her HOA rules mattered more than my deed, more than the generations of paperwork and stewardship that came before her. She thought loud voices beat quiet rights. She thought she could bully her way into control because no one ever told her no. But she learned otherwise. Because when you're standing on land that's legally yours, with the truth in one hand and the title in the other, there's no HOA president, no fine, no phony rulebook that can take that from you. To anyone out there who's been targeted, harassed, or fined for simply using what's theirs, this story is for you. And I want to hear yours, too. Drop your HOA horror stories in the comments. Let's shine some light on just how out of hand these so-called neighborhood enforcers can get. Because it doesn't matter if it's a tent, a porch light, or a driveway grill. Once you know your rights, you stop being a target. And if someone tries to enforce rules on land they don't even own, teach them what ownership really means.